Everyone agrees that I think that 2 Timothy is a letter about ministry written to a Christian worker. What is often not asked is why Timothy might need a letter like this at a point like this. People regularly assume that Paul is kind of getting to the end of his life, as he says he is in chapter 4, and assume that that means that the letter is a letter written to make sure that the gospel ministry is handed over properly to the next generation, a sort of passing the baton kind of letter. And the experienced guy is handing over to a less experienced guy the stuff he wants him to do for the next generation, assuming that he might possibly not if he doesn't get the instruction. I don't think that really works as an analysis of this letter at all. These are Paul's last words in the New Testament, but they're not his last words to Timothy. He assumes he's going to see Timothy again. Paul is not anxious about the future of the gospel work in this letter. Timothy is not a novice in terms of his ministry with Paul. They've had 15 years or so of ministry experience together. He co-authors letters with Paul. Paul sends him to do difficult jobs all over the place in the New Testament. So in many ways, Timothy is Paul's best guy. It is not helpful to view this as the experienced one handing over to the novice just as he's about to die. I think this letter is a rescue package. I think it is written to prevent an experienced gospel worker, namely Timothy, from deserting Paul's pattern of doing ministry. I think the evidence of that in this letter is widespread. The letter is bristling with strong imperatives which don't really make sense unless Timothy is in some way turning away already. Fan into flame the gift of God, says Paul. Well, that implies the gift is going out. Do not be ashamed implies that he might be being ashamed. Share in suffering for the gospel implies that he might not be sharing in suffering or be unwilling to do that. The second reason I think that this letter is a rescue package is that the language of desertion is all over this letter. Chapter 1. All who are in the provinces of Asia have deserted me. Chapter 4, Demas, in love with his present world, has deserted me. Chapter 4, at my first defense, no one stood with me, but all deserted. The letter is topped and tailed with desertion. And I think all the way Paul is asking the question of Timothy, Timothy, will you too be a deserter? Those 3 little illustrations in chapter 2, no soldier on active service gets involved in civilian pursuits. Timothy, are you going to be a deserter? The athlete is only crowned if he plays according to the rules. Timothy, are you going to be a cheat? It's the hard-working farmer who gets a share of the crops. Timothy, are you going to be lazy or hard-working? So I think all over the place in this letter there's evidence that Timothy is already moving away from the pattern and needs to be brought back to it. Third, I think at the end of the letter, Paul actually removes Timothy from the situation in Ephesus. In 1 Timothy, Paul tells Timothy to stay in Ephesus and deal with the problem of false teaching there. At the end of this letter, he says, I want you to come from Ephesus to me in Rome, and I want you to do that soon. And by the way, I'm sending Tychicus to Ephesus to replace you. I think he's trying to pull out of a difficult situation a guy who's no longer able to manage the difficult situation. Sometimes I think we read New Testament letters in a slightly decontextualized way. Here is Paul writing yet another letter to yet another church in trouble somewhere or other at some time or other. We don't pay too much attention to the situations. I think that is really unhelpful. We know that these are not all the letters that Paul ever wrote. Our doctrine of the inspiration of Scripture must include the fact that the Holy Spirit has seen fit to include letters to these particular situations with their particular problems as something we need to know. So I take it that the situations are very important. We have lots of information in the New Testament about the first 30 years of gospel advance. Lots in Acts and lots in the Pauline epistles. And trying to join those up a bit is really helpful. So, for example, with this letter, bearing in mind that the New Testament says that these two have already had a long, long association, and that Timothy is, in many ways, Paul's go-to guy in difficult situations, it would be really crass to assume that here is a letter from the experienced guy handing over to the novice because he's not sure how he's going to do in the future. It's much better to read it differently from that. Secondly, within the letter, there's lots of information that one has to take into account. Now, inevitably, we're a bit cautious about reconstructing situations from New Testament letters. Of course, we've only got one end of a conversation. We've only got Paul's words into the situation. But I think it's incumbent on us to try and piece together a best fit suggestion about what might be going on. What reconstruction best fits the available information? And there's so much in this letter implying that Timothy has to change from what he's doing now. That makes me think that Timothy actually does have to change from what he is doing now. In other words, he is going offline. That question absolutely has to be asked. If it is true that this is a person in trouble, how can it be that anything is big enough trouble for a guy like Timothy, who's got so much experience, to be thrown off by it? Timothy, a very experienced gospel worker, is being presented with a very impressive looking alternative pattern of ministry to Paul's. Unlike Paul's pattern, this pattern does not bring suffering. I think it's a triumphalistic pattern of ministry. In chapter 2, verse 17, we're told about Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have departed from the truth, saying that the resurrection is past already. They're resurrection past already, guys, whatever that means. Timothy must know what that means. Paul, in contrast, looks anything but resurrection past already, suffering, in prison, and all that kind of stuff. So I think Timothy is faced with this very, very impressive looking alternative to Paul's ministry, which he's somewhat swayed by. In chapter 3, what I think Paul does is takes the lid off this. Look, Timothy, it looks impressive. It has the form of godliness, chapter 3, verse 5, but actually it denies the power of godliness. And of course, in this letter, the power of God is shown in willingness to suffer for the truth. So it's an impressive looking ministry, and Paul needs to spend quite a lot of time in chapter 3 showing Timothy what's really going on, bringing it to light. But I think that's the reason. We have two patterns of ministry, one that will mean hardship for Timothy, one that will mean ease for Timothy, one that will mean exclusion, one that will mean recognition and acceptance. Which is he going to do? Yeah, there is little doubt that when you read these two letters, they do appear to be talking about the same sort of situation, the same sorts of issues come up in both letters, albeit slightly more pointedly in 2 Timothy. In 1 Timothy 1:3, Paul says, "As I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus, so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine." There's no doubt that that has changed by 2 Timothy, because at the end of 2 Timothy, Paul says, chapter 4, verse 9, "Do your best to come to me soon." 1 Timothy, stay there as I urged you. 2 Timothy, come to me soon. What's the difference? Well, I think the difference is that in 1 Timothy, Paul is not in prison. And in 2 Timothy, Paul is writing from prison. And in 1 Timothy, chapter 3:14, Paul says, being free to travel around, "I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things so that if I delay, you may know what to be doing." Paul, I think, in 1 Timothy already knows that Timothy is having a very difficult time, but envisages that he may be able to come soon and help. That has gone in 2 Timothy. Paul is writing from prison in 2 Timothy. We don't know quite how much longer after 1 Timothy, probably not more than 2 or 3 years, maybe a much shorter time than that. But I think the difference is that Timothy is in the same church, in the same situation, similarly struggling, perhaps further down the line now, and Paul now knows he cannot come to him. So instead of getting Paul coming to Timothy, he writes to Timothy to come to him and sends another guy instead. Well, I think the implications of this letter are many and various, and they range from the fairly obvious to the much less obvious. Here's an obvious one. You cannot read 2 Timothy without coming away with the impression that doing gospel ministry from time to time is really hard. It is very important for Christian workers to know that. It is very important for churches to know that, because we are all engaged together in the same sort of work. Sometimes it's really hard, and that just goes with the territory. Here's a less obvious one. One of the things this letter tells us is that the biggest hardships in ministry come from unexpected quarters. We do not expect the world outside to be on our side with the gospel. It's nice if it is, but we're not expecting that. We do not expect the government to support us in the gospel ministry. It's nice if they do, and sometimes they make life easier and sometimes they make it harder, but we're not expecting them to make it easier. However, we do expect that the people we trained in our church, which our leaders invested their time and energy in, will remain true to the gospel. Paul's great disappointment in this letter is that the people he trained in Ephesus 10 years later are no longer doing his pattern of ministry. That people who work with him on his team as co-workers have deserted him in his time of need. That Timothy, his best guy, is teetering on the brink of desertion. Those are surprises we'd rather not face up to and rather not have in ministry. They're very disappointing. This letter tells us that that kind of desertion is a reality in ministry, and we ought to get used to it. Some of the implications of this letter are totally disregarded. The most obvious one, I think, is our attitude to training people. We now, in this country anyway, sometimes invest quite a lot of energy and time in training people up for gospel ministry. We get them involved in a church apprenticeship scheme, we send them to the Cornhill training course, we send them to a decent theological college. We invest lots of time and energy at the beginning. We wind them up, but then we let them go. If this letter is to be believed, that is a serious mistake, because Timothy has been very well trained by the best guy. And if he is in danger of toppling over after 15 years, then anyone is in danger toppling over after 15 years. Paul demonstrates in this letter a serious long-term commitment to the guy that he has trained. And if we're not just to get people into ministry, but to keep them going long-term, then we need to be investing in our relationship with people long-term, not merely investing with them at the start of stuff. Yeah, it's easy looking at a letter like this to think, well, this is a letter for specialists and those who train specialists. Why would a congregation need to know this? Well, I can think of several reasons for that. One, the work of the gospel is everybody's work. And if a congregation does not understand how difficult ministry can sometimes be for those who have it as a big job, then they will not understand the pressures that their leaders are under. They will not understand the pressures that their missionaries will be under. They will not understand the pressure they may be under themselves if they run into difficulty. Every so often congregations choose a new small group Bible study leader or a new Sunday school teacher or a new, I don't know, all sorts of things. Do you want people who follow Paul's pattern of ministry for those jobs, or people who want to have a more triumphalist sort of everything is good now pattern of ministry for those sorts of jobs? Fundamentally, a congregation also determines who teaches and what pattern of ministry. If a congregation does not know what the pattern of ministry is that it needs to have in its leaders, it will appoint the wrong people to positions of ministry responsibility. A congregation needs to appoint suitable people to levels of responsibility within the congregation. If you're choosing a Sunday school teacher, do you want a Sunday school teacher who does it according to Paul's pattern, or a more triumphalist looking Sunday school teacher, and so on and so on. Basically, the ministry is everyone's, and everyone is involved in it, although in different ways. If people do not understand it, that will make the ministry fall over. So a congregation needs to be taught about what ministry is like at every opportunity, because the congregation is involved in that work and in determining the future of that work.